The bitter wind cut through Clara's thin cloak as she trudged through the snow-laden path toward the river. Each step sank into the icy crust, sending shivers up her spine, but fear pushed her forward faster than exhaustion ever could. She clutched her baby tightly against her chest, the infant's small body trembling with cold. The baby's cries pierced the frozen air, echoing off the distant mountains, mixing with the whistle of the wind through the bare trees. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, not from the exertion but from the dread of what lay ahead. She had fled with no plan, only the instinct to survive. And the river, now partially frozen, blocked her path like an unforgiving wall of ice and water. The river had once been a gentle, flowing line through the valley, its surface sparkling under the weak winter sun. Now, sheets of ice covered most of it, cracked and brittle, revealing glimpses of the deadly current beneath. Clara knew the danger, but she had no choice. Her pursuers were close, and the river was the only route to safety. Her mind raced as she searched for the safest crossing point. She picked a spot where the ice seemed thickest, holding her baby close to prevent him from slipping or crying too loudly. One misstep could mean disaster, but the cold, the snow, and her fear blurred her judgment. With tentative steps, she tested the ice before venturing further. The surface groaned under her weight, small fractures appearing like spider webs. Every snap made her heart leap, but the thought of turning back was worse. Her mind flashed to the figures behind her, angry men, strangers who would not hesitate to harm her or her child. Her breaths came out in visible clouds, each one a reminder that the winter could be as deadly as any human threat. The baby stirred, tiny fists pressing against her chest, and Clara whispered promises of safety she wasn't sure she could keep. Suddenly, the ice gave way beneath her foot with a sharp crack. Panic surged through her as she teetered on the edge of the freezing water. The river seemed to mock her, its dark, swirling depths ready to consume her and her baby. Clara's instincts kicked in. She pressed the child closer, wrapping her arms around him as she tried to find something solid to hold on to. Her heart raced with the realization that one wrong move could mean they would be swept away by the icy current, leaving no chance of rescue. The snow around her was slippery, the current beneath her relentless, and the river widened before her like a trap with no escape. As the cold water seeped through the thin layers of her clothing, Clara's teeth chattered uncontrollably. Her vision blurred from the cold and fear, but she could not let herself succumb to despair. She dug her fingers into the fragile ice, trying to anchor herself, but it was no use. The ice was too thin, cracking further with every small shift. Clara's mind raced, thinking of ways to save herself and her child. She whispered calming words to the baby, though her own voice shook with terror. She counted her breaths, clinging to a fragile hope that someone, anyone, might appear to save them from this frozen death. The river, merciless and indifferent, encased them both in ice and cold, a stark reminder of nature's power. Clara's fight for survival had only just begun, and the minutes stretched endlessly as she balanced on the edge of life and death, desperate to hold on to her baby and herself. It was in this moment, suspended between fear and hopelessness, that the first glimmer of salvation appeared. A figure moving across the snow, strong and determined, braving the same bitter cold that threatened to claim them both. Elias had been tracking the path of the river for hours, his boots crunching against the crusted snow, each step deliberate and practiced. The mountains were his home, their harsh winters and hidden trails familiar to him in a way few outsiders could ever understand. He had grown up with the wind whipping against his face and the cold gnawing at his bones, learning early that survival meant awareness, speed, and courage. But even he had never seen a scene like the one now unfolding before him through the snow-laden trees. He caught sight of a woman precariously balanced on the edge of the partially frozen river, a tiny infant clutched to her chest. Elias's eyes narrowed, scanning the treacherous ice that groaned and cracked under her weight. The sight set his instincts ablaze. He knew the river could claim them both in moments if he hesitated. Without thinking twice, he began moving toward her, adjusting his pace to keep steady footing on the uneven, snow-covered ground. Each step was calculated. He avoided loose snow that might give way and tested the stability of ice patches before crossing. His breath formed white clouds in the frigid air, but his focus was unshakable. He could see the terror on the woman's face and hear the faint cries of the baby carried on the wind, each sound sharpening his resolve. Elias was no stranger to danger. Years spent hunting in the wilderness, living off the land, and navigating the mountains' hidden paths had honed his instincts. But the stakes had never felt so personal. This was not a hunt or a test of endurance. It was a life-or-death moment for a mother and her child, and the responsibility pressed on him like a physical weight. He scanned the river for the safest approach, noting the patches of thin ice and the swirling currents below. Even a misstep on his part could spell disaster not just for the woman and her baby, but for him as well. He stopped momentarily behind a thick cluster of pine trees, taking in the scene. The ice beneath the woman's feet had already begun to fracture in widening lines, the river's dark water bubbling through the cracks. Her small form wobbled as she tried to find stable footing, arms shaking as she pressed the baby closer. He grabbed a sturdy branch from the forest floor, its weight and length perfect for testing the ice and giving the woman something to cling to. With a deep breath, Elias stepped out from the safety of the trees, boots crunching loudly in the snow. The woman looked up at him, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of terror and disbelief. He called out, his voice firm but calm, cutting through the roar of the river and the howl of the wind. "Hold on, I'll get you." The words seemed almost insignificant against the raw power of the frozen river, but in that instant, they were a lifeline. Elias took another careful step onto the ice, testing its strength, and then another. Every movement was precise, calculated, a balance between courage and caution. He could feel the icy surface threatening to give way beneath him, but he pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that hesitation would mean death for the pair ahead of him. The snow whipped at his face, and cold seeped through his gloves, but he ignored the physical pain. There was no room for weakness here. The woman's lips parted as she whispered a quiet, frightened plea, barely audible over the river's roar. Elias nodded to her, his eyes locked on the baby's trembling form. He knew that one wrong move could end in tragedy, but he had faced the mountain's dangers his entire life. Now, for the first time, he was risking himself not for survival or pride, but for another human being, a mother and her child teetering on the edge of death. With one last assessment of the ice's fragile strength, Elias prepared to close the remaining distance. His muscles tensed, and his heart pounded not with fear, but with determination. This was the moment that would define everything, the leap from safety into danger to save two innocent lives. Elias could see the cracks widening beneath Clara's feet, spiderweb patterns spreading across the ice with every hesitant shift she made. The river groaned and hissed as if warning him to stay back, but retreat was not an option. The mother's arms trembled under the weight of her baby, and the infant's tiny hands clutched at her coat, fists curled in fear. Elias's chest tightened. Time was slipping away, every second carrying them closer to a frozen death. He knew that waiting, calculating, or hesitating even a moment longer could cost them their lives. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the icy wind and the rush of adrenaline that coursed through his veins. In one fluid motion, Elias stepped forward and leaped onto the ice. It shivered and cracked beneath him, sending shockwaves through the frozen surface. But he landed steadily, knees bent, and balanced like a predator poised for the kill. Clara gasped, her eyes widening in terror, but there was no time for words. The river beneath them was merciless whirls of black water, swift and unrelenting, threatened to swallow them with every movement. Elias dropped to his stomach, crawling across the ice, testing the fragile surface with careful pressure. He extended the thick branch he had grabbed earlier toward Clara, a lifeline she could grasp. Her hands shook violently as she reached for it, the baby squirming against her chest. The ice beneath her groaned, and for a heart-stopping moment, it seemed as if it would give way entirely. Elias lunged forward, grabbing her wrist and steadying her, while the other hand reached for the infant, lifting him carefully from her arms. The cold was an enemy, clawing at their skin, numbing fingers and toes within seconds. The baby whimpered, tiny breaths visible in the frigid air, and Clara's teeth chattered uncontrollably. Elias ignored the biting chill, his focus solely on keeping them alive. The river's current tugged at the fragile ice, threatening to drag the mother and child into its dark depths. With Herculean strength, he began to crawl backward, distributing his weight carefully to prevent further cracking. Every movement had to be deliberate. The ice was unpredictable, and any miscalculation could mean disaster. Halfway across the treacherous expanse, a large sheet of ice gave way beneath him with a violent crack, sending a wave of icy water rushing over his gloves and sleeves. The freezing liquid stole his breath, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. Clara clung to him, the baby tucked safely under his arm, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to nothing but the three of them, suspended between life and death on a fragile frozen stage. Elias whispered to Clara, calming her terror, "I've got you. Just hold on." His voice was steady, unwavering, even as the cold tried to pierce every fiber of his body. Finally, with one last determined push, Elias dragged them onto a stable patch of ice near the riverbank. He collapsed onto the snow, gasping for air, and carefully set the baby down, wrapping both mother and child in his thick coat. Clara shivered violently, the trauma and cold overwhelming her senses, but the warmth of the coat and the presence of her rescuer offered a fragile glimmer of hope. She looked up at Elias, eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude, unable to form words, while the baby nestled against his chest, finally calm in the safety of human arms. Elias surveyed the river one last time. The danger had not disappeared, the ice still groaned, the current still roared, but they were safe for now. His body ached from the effort, muscles trembling from the icy shock, but relief washed over him. They had survived the river. In that frozen, silent wilderness, a bond had been formed, forged in fear, courage, and raw survival instinct. The snow fell gently around them, a stark contrast to the chaos of moments ago, as if nature itself acknowledged the life that had been saved. Elias didn't pause for rest. The riverbank offered temporary relief from the immediate danger, but the bitter wind and deep snow still threatened Clara and her baby. He wrapped his coat tightly around both of them, pressing the infant close to his chest, and held Clara by the arm, helping her regain her balance. Her body shook uncontrollably from the freezing water, teeth chattering, skin flushed with both cold and adrenaline. The baby, soothed by the warmth of Ilias's chest and steady heartbeat, had finally gone quiet, eyes blinking sleepily against the harsh winter light. Ilias's own body ached from the strain of the rescue. The cold had seeped into his muscles, and each breath felt like inhaling needles, but he ignored it. Their safety mattered more than his comfort or pain. He led them carefully up the uneven riverbank, each step calculated to avoid hidden patches of ice or loose snow. Clara's legs wobbled under her, weak from the shock of near drowning, and Elias supported her firmly, murmuring reassurances in a calm, steady voice. "We're safe now," he said, though he knew the mountains held their own dangers. "Just a little further, and you'll be warm." His eyes scanned the landscape constantly, aware that even the riverbank was unforgiving, that nature itself could turn deadly in a heartbeat. But he did not falter. Reaching a small clearing near the edge of the woods, Elias spotted a thick cluster of pine trees. Their branches, laden with snow, offered some shelter from the relentless wind. He gently set Clara down on a patch of dry ground, brushing snow off her cloak and untangling strands of hair that clung to her frozen skin. The baby whimpered, tiny lips quivering, and Elias stroked the infant's back, whispering softly, trying to calm both mother and child. His hands were cold, stiff, and aching, but he worked quickly, understanding that warmth and stability were crucial at this moment. Clara's eyes met his, wide and shimmering with tears. I don't know how to," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know how. We survived." Elias shook his head gently, cutting her off with a firm but kind voice. "You survived because you held on. That's all that mattered. Now, we move forward." He could see the lingering fear in her gaze, the kind that comes from staring death in the face, but also a fragile thread of trust beginning to form. He lifted the baby again, holding him close to prevent further exposure to the cold, and gestured for Clara to follow him. "I have a cabin not far from here," he said. "You'll be warm, safe, dry." Clara nodded, too exhausted and overwhelmed to argue, and allowed herself to be guided. Every step through the snow was deliberate, Elias supporting her, making sure neither stumbled or fell. The river lay behind them now, a brutal memory of ice and water that would linger in their minds. But ahead was something more: hope. Along the way, Elias kept watch for hidden dangers, sharp rocks beneath the snow, sudden dips in the terrain, or the risk of ice patches that could betray their footing. His life experience in these mountains had honed him to read every subtle sign, every hint from the land. He moved with quiet authority, a presence both protective and commanding. And Clara instinctively followed, her fear giving way slowly to a sense of security she hadn't felt in days. At last, they reached a small, rugged cabin nestled among the trees, smoke curling from the chimney. Elias pushed open the door, revealing warmth and light inside. The cabin smelled of firewood and earth, a comforting contrast to the bitter cold outside. He set Clara and the baby down near the hearth, immediately tending to their frostbitten hands and feet, rubbing them gently to restore circulation. The baby yawned, eyes growing heavy, while Clara sank to the floor, shivering but alive, grateful beyond words for the stranger who had risked everything to save them. In that quiet cabin, away from the deadly river and the harsh wilderness, the first spark of trust and hope began to take root. Clara realized that survival was only the beginning. What lay ahead with this mountain man by her side might be the chance for something greater: safety, warmth, and perhaps even the beginnings of a fragile connection she hadn't expected to find in the frozen wilderness. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around Clara and her baby like a protective blanket, a stark contrast to the icy wind and merciless river they had just escaped. Smoke curled lazily from the stone hearth, carrying the scent of pine and charred wood. Elias knelt beside the fire, carefully tending the small blaze to ensure it would burn steadily through the long winter night. Clara sat on a thick woolen blanket, still shivering, the baby nestled against her chest. Each exhale came in visible puffs, but slowly, the warmth began to seep into their bones, easing the ache of cold and fear. Elias moved methodically, almost silently, as he tended to them. He checked the baby's tiny hands and feet, rubbing them gently to restore circulation, while whispering soft reassurances that seemed to pierce through the lingering terror in Clara's mind. The infant, comforted by his steady presence, finally relaxed, tiny fingers curling around her mother's and then Elias's as he handed the baby back. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from overwhelming relief. She had survived the river, and somehow, against all odds, they were alive. Sitting across from her, Elias studied her quietly, his rugged face softened by concern. "You're safe now," he said simply, though there was more in his tone than mere words. He had saved lives today, but he also recognized the deeper scars the ordeal had left: fear, exhaustion, and the fragile thread of trust that must now be woven. Clara nodded, too tired to speak, her gratitude reflected in the way she held her baby tightly. The silence of the cabin was heavy but comforting, a pause from the chaos of the frozen wilderness outside. As minutes stretched into hours, Clara began to speak, haltingly at first. She told Elias about why she had fled, though her words were fragmented and tinged with pain. Each confession seemed to lighten the weight on her shoulders, her voice trembling but growing steadier with every word. Elias listened, never interrupting, his presence a solid anchor in the emotional storm. He offered little advice, only occasional nods or murmurs of understanding, allowing Clara to share her fears and sorrows without judgment. The baby, sensing the calmer energy of the room, began to coo softly, tugging at Clara's scarf. Elias smiled faintly at the sound, an almost imperceptible thaw in his usually stoic demeanor. He fetched a small pot, warming water, and preparing a simple meal of porridge, which Clara accepted with a tentative smile. For the first time since the river, she felt nourishment not only for her body but for her spirit. Elias's cabin, sparse yet functional, provided not just physical shelter but a sense of security she had not felt in weeks. Hours passed, and as the fire crackled, Clara's shivering subsided, replaced by a warm, lingering exhaustion. Elias draped another blanket over her shoulders, and she allowed herself to lean against him slightly, seeking comfort in his quiet strength. There was a careful rhythm to the cabin now, the baby's soft breathing, the steady warmth of the fire, and Elias's occasional movements around the room, gathering firewood or adjusting blankets. Each action reinforced the sense of safety that had been absent for so long. By nightfall, the storm outside had intensified, but inside, a fragile peace had taken hold. Clara watched Elias prepare a small area for the baby to sleep safely, and she felt an unfamiliar sense of gratitude, not just for his courage, but for his care, his attentiveness, and the quiet reassurance that they were no longer alone. She realized that survival was only the beginning. Now, in this remote cabin, there was the chance to heal, to regain strength, and perhaps to rebuild the shattered sense of trust that had been broken by the outside world. As Clara drifted into a restless sleep, with the baby snuggled close, she felt a new awareness of Elias beside her, a mountain man whose life had been shaped by solitude and hardship, now intertwined with hers through courage, compassion, and shared survival. In the heart of the frozen wilderness, the seeds of connection had been planted, fragile yet enduring, promising that the trials of the day might one day lead to hope, safety, and something more profound than mere survival. Days passed in the mountain cabin, each one slow but steady, allowing Clara, her baby, and Elias to settle into a fragile rhythm. The storm outside raged on, a constant reminder of the wilderness's harshness. Yet inside the small cabin, life moved with deliberate calm. Clara began to notice the quiet routines that defined Elias' existence. How he tended the fire with meticulous care, how he moved through the space without unnecessary noise, and how every action seemed infused with a quiet strength born of solitude and survival. She had lived in fear and chaos for so long that the simple order of his life struck her like a revelation. At first, interactions were limited to necessities, sharing meals, ensuring the fire remained lit, and keeping the baby warm. But slowly, a bond began to form, subtle yet undeniable. Clara observed Elias, teaching her small skills she had never needed before: how to layer clothes against the cold, how to test the stability of snow before stepping, and how to prepare simple sustenance from sparse ingredients. There was no condescension in his instruction, only patience and an implicit trust in her ability to learn. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a spark of agency return, a small but vital thread of hope woven into the fabric of her days. Elias, in turn, began to open up in small ways. Clara noticed the softness in his eyes when he looked at her and the baby, the subtle attentiveness in his movements, and the quiet pride he took in her small accomplishments. He did not speak much of his past, his family, the years he had spent in isolation, but the way he shared the cabin, the food, and the warmth of the fire communicated more than words ever could. Gradually, Clara sensed that he was as drawn to her resilience and courage as she was to his steadfastness and protective instincts. One afternoon, as snow fell heavily outside, Elias brought a bundle of herbs he had collected from the forest. He carefully brewed a tea, the steam curling invitingly between them. Clara watched him, mesmerized by the ease of his movements and the quiet confidence he exuded. She reached out tentatively to help, and their hands brushed over the warm cup. A shared smile lingered, small but significant, and it felt as though the walls they both carried were beginning to crumble. In that simple act, brewing tea together, they discovered a sense of companionship neither had anticipated. Forged, not through words but through gestures and presence. The baby, too, played a role in their connection, bringing light and laughter into the cabin. Small giggles echoed against the wooden walls, forcing Elias to soften his usually stoic expression. Clara watched him, amazed at the tenderness he displayed, a side of him that the wilderness had never demanded but which shone effortlessly in the presence of her child. The three of them were forming a fragile, imperfect family, bound together by survival, trust, and the shared vulnerability of being exposed to forces far greater than themselves. Evenings were quiet, filled with the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic breathing of the baby. Clara would sit close to Elias, occasionally sharing fragments of her life before the flight, and though he spoke sparingly, his listening and subtle nods conveyed understanding and respect. She began to sense that he had no intention of letting them leave unprotected, that his courage and quiet steadfastness were now intertwined with concern, even affection. A bond had formed in the crucible of life and death, and it was slowly deepening, delicate yet undeniable. By the end of the week, Clara realized that fear had receded slightly, replaced with trust, respect, and the faint stirrings of attraction she did not fully understand. Elias too seemed transformed, not in grand gestures or proclamations, but in subtle attentiveness, in the way he moved through the cabin, and how he quietly ensured their survival and comfort. The frozen wilderness outside had once been a threat, but now it felt like a backdrop to a new beginning. In the quiet intimacy of the cabin, survival had given way to connection, and trust had blossomed into the earliest hints of something deeper, a bond forged in courage, kindness, and the shared understanding of fragility and resilience. The quiet they had found in the mountains was shattered one gray morning. Clara, standing near the cabin door, saw faint tracks in the snow, human footprints, large and deliberate, moving toward them through the drifts. Her heart clenched, a familiar fear rising like ice through her veins. Her pursuers had not given up. They had tracked her to the remote wilderness, intent on retrieving her, and now, after days of relative safety, danger had returned. The fragile peace she had begun to enjoy threatened to crumble, and she instinctively clutched her baby closer. Elias, sensing her tension before she even spoke, moved beside her. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the forest edge, noting the prints, the direction, the spacing, and even the likely size and number of men approaching. Years in the mountains had honed his instincts to perfection. He knew that the best chance for survival was preparation, and he wasted no time. Clara could see the shift in him come, resolute, yet filled with a simmering intensity. He had faced life and death countless times in the wild, but now it was not the river, not the cold, not the wilderness, they were human threats, cunning and persistent. He guided Clara back into the cabin, instructing her to stay close and keep the baby quiet. "We're going to make sure they don't reach us," he said firmly, his voice a steady anchor against the rising panic. Clara nodded, fear and admiration mingling in her gaze. Elias quickly began to fortify the cabin and surrounding area. He used his knowledge of the forest to create natural barriers, branches twisted into crude fences, snow piled strategically, and hidden traps set for anyone attempting a direct approach. Each movement was precise, calculated, and deliberate, demonstrating the survival skills that had kept him alive in the mountains for years. As the footprints drew nearer, the sounds of snapping branches and murmured voices carried on the cold wind. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps, but Elias's calm presence reassured her. He crouched beside her, whispering instructions on how to remain hidden and alert. The baby, sensing the tension, stirred and whined softly. Elias picked him up, pressing him against his chest. The sound of the infant's heartbeat seemed to steady them both, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. The pursuers reached the perimeter Elias had prepared. One man stumbled into a cleverly disguised trap, falling into a snow-filled pit, while another skidded on hidden ice patches. Elias used the natural terrain to his advantage, leading the attackers into areas where the snow and ice worked against them. His actions were swift and precise, a combination of instinct, strength, and mountain wisdom. Clara watched in awe as he moved like a shadow through the snow, keeping both her and the baby safe while neutralizing threats before they could cause harm. Despite the danger, Clara noticed something else, a deep sense of trust forming within her. In moments like this, she realized how profoundly Elias cared, not just for survival, but for their lives. He was willing to risk everything to protect them. The cabin became more than shelter. It was a fortress, a sanctuary shaped by his experience and his unwavering dedication. The attackers, frustrated and defeated by the traps and terrain, eventually retreated, realizing that the mountain had claimed the advantage and that Elias had anticipated their every move. After the threat had passed, Clara sank to the floor, exhausted but safe, with the baby cradled against her chest. Elias returned to the cabin, brushing snow from his coat, his face grim but composed. "They're gone, for now," he said. His eyes softened when they met hers, and for the first time, Clara saw not only a protector but someone who had become indispensable in her life. The mountains had tested them, but through courage, strategy, and trust, they had survived again. In the quiet that followed, Clara realized that their bond had deepened in ways she had never anticipated. Danger had returned, but so had clarity. Elias was no longer just a rescuer, he was her anchor, her protector, and perhaps, in time, something more. The wilderness outside remained harsh and unforgiving, but inside the cabin, a fragile family had emerged, united by survival, courage, and a growing connection that neither cold nor danger could sever. The morning sun broke over the mountains, casting a pale golden glow across the snow-covered landscape. Clara awoke in the cabin, the baby nestled safely against her chest. Both of them warm and untroubled for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The storm that had raged for days outside had passed, leaving a crisp, serene silence in its wake. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to breathe deeply, feeling the weight of constant fear and uncertainty begin to lift. The icy river, the relentless pursuers, and the perilous journey were now memories, etched sharply in her mind, but softened by the reality of safety. Elias moved quietly around the cabin, preparing a simple breakfast and tending the fire. He had not spoken much during the night, allowing Clara to rest, but his presence was unwavering, silent reassurance that they were protected. Clara watched him, noting the ease with which he moved through the space, the natural authority and strength that radiated from every gesture. He glanced at her briefly, and in that shared look, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They had survived, together, and now the future was theirs to shape. Once breakfast was finished, Elias bundled the baby in a warm blanket and carried him outside to the sunlit snow, allowing the child to explore safely under watchful eyes. Clara stepped beside them, laughter bubbling from her lips as the baby's tiny feet crunched against the fresh snow. It was a simple moment, but for Clara, it represented everything she had longed for: safety, freedom, and the ability to embrace life without constant fear. Elias smiled faintly at the sight, a rare softness in his normally stoic expression. In that moment, Clara understood that this man had become more than a rescuer. He was a constant, dependable presence, a partner in a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. The days that followed were filled with quiet routine and the slow building of trust and companionship. Elias taught Clara more about surviving in the mountains, but this time it was not solely about survival, it was about thriving. She learned to read the landscape, to track animals, and to prepare the land for the harsh winter months. Each lesson deepened their bond, fostering mutual respect and admiration. At night, they would sit by the fire, talking quietly of their pasts, dreams, and the lives they hoped to build. The shared experiences of danger and survival had forged a connection that was resilient, tempered by adversity and strengthened by trust. Clara's heart began to heal as she realized that Elias had provided more than shelter. He had offered her a home. The baby's laughter echoed through the cabin, a constant reminder of the life they had preserved and the love that had begun to grow in this secluded corner of the world. In Elias's presence, she felt courage returning to her own veins, the fear that had dominated her life slowly dissolving into hope. The mountains, once a place of danger and isolation, had become a sanctuary, a place where she and her child could flourish under the protection of someone who had risked everything to keep them safe. As winter gradually softened into spring, the snow melting into streams and rivers, Clara and Elias stood at the edge of the cabin clearing, looking out over the mountains. The landscape was breathtaking, wild, and untamed, yet it now represented possibility rather than threat. Elias reached for Clara's hand, and she took it without hesitation, the gesture speaking volumes of trust, gratitude, and burgeoning love. The baby gurgled happily between them, a living symbol of survival and the promise of a new life. In that moment, the frozen river, the terror, and the wilderness seemed like distant memories. What remained was the beginning of something enduring, a family forged in courage, compassion, and resilience. Together, Clara, her baby, and Elias would face the future not with fear, but with hope, strength, and the quiet certainty that they could overcome anything as long as they had each other. Life in the mountains, once a test of survival, had become a canvas for a new beginning, where warmth, love, and trust would grow stronger with each passing day.